My name is Ron Ortiz. I'm a graduate student at UNLV. I'm here today with four of my fellow graduate students to provide a case briefing on an important U.S. Supreme Court case. This case set an important precedent for lower courts and serves as a guide in how the courts handle structured settlements under bankruptcy law. Czyzewski versus Jevic Holding Corp. Was a Supreme Court case decided in 2017 that centered on one of the most important issues in recent memory focused on U.S. bankruptcy law. Jevic Transportation, Inc. was a trucking company headquartered in New Jersey. In 2008, the company filed for bankruptcy under Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code. At that point, it owed approximately $73 million to its senior secured creditors and general unsecured creditors. When it became clear that the liquidation of assets would not be enough to cover the company's liabilities, the lenders seized control of the company and sought to find a settlement with creditors. The company was sued by a group of its truck drivers for violating the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Act, better known as the WARN Act, which required the company to provide a 60-day notice to workers before they were laid off. This violation of state and federal law resulted in the workers receiving a judgment of over $15 million. Under bankruptcy law, this claim against the company's assets was a first priority claim. These priority claims would generally have primary standing over secured and unsecured creditor claims under bankruptcy law. In addition, the company was also sued by creditors, hoping to recover some of the money they loaned the company. The lender-owner negotiated with creditors and agreed to a structured settlement that would end the bankruptcy case and provide available funds to partially cover claims for secured and unsecured claims. However, the structured settlement negotiated amongst the creditors specifically excluded the primary claims of the truckers. The truckers objected to the structured settlement on the grounds that their claims were first priority claims under bankruptcy law, and therefore the structured settlement required their approval. This was the fundamental question for the court to decide. Can a bankruptcy court authorize a distribution of settlement proceeds in a manner that does not comply with the Bankruptcy Code's priority distribution laws? The bankruptcy court said yes and approved the structured settlement. The case then was appealed to the Federal District Court, the Third Circuit Appeals Court, and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court. Up next, Kalyani will pick up the briefing with appellant arguments to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Thank you. My name is Kalyani Ganapathy Reddy. I'll be presenting the appellant arguments in Suzuki vs. Jevic Holding Corporation Supreme Court case. The appellants made three main arguments, and I walk through each of them in a clear way. The first argument is that bankruptcy courts priority rules are strict requirements, not something courts can adjust based on the situation. In this case, the truck drivers had the priority wage claims, which means that under the law, they were supposed to be paid before certain other creditors gets paid. But the structured dismissal approved in the lower court did exactly opposite. It paid the lower priority creditors and left the drivers with nothing. The appellants say that courts simply do not have the authority to approve any outcome that intentionally violates the priority system created. These rules are mandatory and not optional. The second argument is that structured dismissals cannot be used as a workaround to avoid following the code. Structured dismissals are not directly provided in the bankruptcy code. So if money is used, it still has to follow the same legal requirements that apply to all bankruptcy resolutions, including respecting creditors' priority. The appellants emphasize that while bankruptcy courts do have equitable powers, those powers are limited. They cannot be used to reach an outcome that the bankruptcy code itself would never allow. In short, a court cannot rely on a structured dismissal to override the law or to reorder who gets paid based on the conveyance. The final argument that outcomes in this case is fundamentally unfair. The truck drivers who had higher priority claims were the only group completely excluded from the settlement, while the creditors with the lower priority claims have received the money. The appellants say that this kind of result encourages side deals and the private negotiation that cuts out the very people from the bankruptcy code is designed to protect. Allowing this type of settlement, they argue, would undermine the confidence in the entire bankruptcy process because it lets the parties ignore the rights of the priority creditors when it suits them. To summarize, the appellants are asking the Supreme Court to hold that a structured dismissal is invalid if it distributes assets in a way that violates the court's priority rules, unless the creditors who are skipped actually agrees for it. The Supreme Court ultimately agreed with the position and ruled that priority skipping structured dismissals are not allowed. This concludes the appellant arguments. The appeals arguments will now be presented by the Congress Gomez. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Conrad Gomez, and I will now be presenting the arguments made by the appellees in this case. These include Jevic Holding Corporation, Sun Capital, CIT Group, and the Official Committee of Unsecured Creditors. Their position focused on why the structured dismissal should be allowed under the circumstances and why it did not violate bankruptcy law as they understood it. The appellees argued that the structured settlement was the only practical option available to the bankruptcy court. By the time negotiations took place, Jevic had no operating business left and almost no remaining assets. The only value that could be distributed came from a small amount of cash, subject to a lien, and a pending fraudulent conveyance lawsuit. Without the settlement, they argued that no creditor, secured or otherwise, would receive any meaningful recovery. Because of this, they maintained that approving the settlement was better than allowing the case to collapse without distributing anything to anyone. They also argued that the normal priority rules in the Bankruptcy Code apply specifically to Chapter 11 plans and Chapter 7 liquidations, but not to dismissals. Since this case involved a structured dismissal, not a reorganization plan, they stated that the code did not require the same strict ordering of payments. The appellee emphasized that the bankruptcy courts have long been given flexibility under Rule 9019 to approve settlements when doing so benefits the estate as a whole. In addition, the appellees maintained that the settlement provided real and immediate value. CIT agreed to contribute $2 million to cover administrative expenses, and Sun Capital agreed to release its lien on the remaining cash so that funds could be distributed to unsecured creditors. They stressed that without this negotiated deal, these funds would not exist and unsecured creditors would receive nothing at all. The appellee also stated that Sun Capital had a legitimate reason for opposing payments to the truck drivers. At the time, the workers still had an active lawsuit pending against Sun Capital. Because Sun did not want this money used to finance litigation being brought against itself, the settlement excluded the workers from the distribution. The appellees argued that this was not unlawful but simply a practical business decision made during negotiations. Finally, they emphasized that the settlement was fair and reasonable under bankruptcy standards. It avoided years of expensive litigation, maximized what little value remained in the estate, and represented the best possible outcome for the company's financial collapse. Up next, Francisco will walk us through the court's analysis of these arguments and the Supreme Court's final decision in this case.
We're going to discuss the analysis and holding of the Supreme Court in the case Czyzewski versus Jevic Holding Corp. First, let's go over how the Supreme Court analyzed the case to reach a decision. The Supreme Court concluded with rejecting the respondent's argument and determined that the petitioners have standing in the case. After this conclusion, the Supreme Court answered the important question in this case, which was, can a bankruptcy court approve a structural dismissal that provides for dispositions that do not follow a ordinary priority rules without the affected creditor's consent? The Supreme Court answer to this question was no. The Supreme Court reaffirmed that the bankruptcy code priority system is a fundamental part of business bankruptcy law, in which a specific order is followed when it comes to the dispositions of assets when bankruptcy occurs. But in the case in the Chapter 11 bankruptcy case, this code has some flexibility but emphasizes that the priority system rule cannot be broken without the consent of the higher priority creditors. To support this reasoning, the Supreme Court cited the House of Representatives Committee report from 1994, in which they quoted that Congress said the code is, quote, designed to enforce a disposition of the debtor's assets in an orderly manner in accordance with established principles rather than on the basis of inside influence or economic leverage of a particular creditor. Quote. The Supreme Court didn't want to say that if Congress intended to allow structural dismissals as a way to allow priority violating final dispositions, then Congress would have made that clear in the laws, in which the Supreme Court found no evidence in the bankruptcy code. The Supreme Court wanted to say that in the context of a Chapter 11 bankruptcy case being dismissed, there is a circumstance that allow a judge to, for cause, to allow the flexibility to make other orders. But the Supreme Court concluded the word cause is too weak of an argument for not following the priority system, and that courts must interpret statutes as a whole and not be guided just by a single sentence. The Supreme Court also noted that there was no other case like this one that approved the structural dismissal without the creditor's consent, but did acknowledge that there have been some cases where the normal priority rules were not followed, but those cases had different circumstances and facts that did not relate to this case. The Supreme Court went on to say that this case resembles more like an attempt to bypass the bankruptcy codes and cited other cases where lower courts did not allow for bypassing the bankruptcy codes that are set into place, therefore emphasizing the courts cannot use structural dismissals to override codes set in place in bankruptcy law. The Supreme Court recognized that the Third Circuit Court allowed priority violating structural dismissals only in rare cases in which the courts could find sufficient reasons. But the Supreme Court rejected this argument as they said that what is considered sufficient reasons is too vague, and that could lead to these rare cases becoming more of a general rule, which would undermine the clarity and predictability that the bankruptcy code is designed to provide. In which the Supreme Court ended with saying that Congress does not allow these rare cases exceptions for allowing priority violating dispositions, and the courts cannot deviate from procedures set forth in the bankruptcy code, even if they believe some creditors would benefit from it. With all the reasonings the Supreme Court brought forward, the holding of this case was the Supreme Court reversed the judgment of the Courts of Appeals, and the case was remanded to the lower courts to proceed in accordance with law. Ultimately, the Supreme Court held that the bankruptcy courts cannot approve a structural dismissal that violates the priority system without the consent of the affected creditors. In this case, there was a dissent by Justice Thomas that was joined with Justice Alito, in which they disagreed with the majority reasoning because they said they granted to hear this case based on the question if bankruptcy courts could allow dispositions that violate the priority rule. But once the case got heard, the petitioners changed the questions to focus more on structural dismissals, in which they felt the Supreme Court did not have much guidance on this topic. Additionally, they said this change of questions like a bait and switch tactic and should not be rewarded, as this could cause future cases to use this tactic that should not be allowed. For these reasons, Justice Thomas and Justice Alito dissented. Now that we've gone over the Supreme Court's holding and analysis, let's go over to Justine, who will be going over the impact and significance of this case.
The Czyzewski versus Jevic Holding Corp decision has made a major impact on how bankruptcy cases are handled, because it sends a strong message that courts are not allowed to ignore the bankruptcy code just to make the case easier to resolve. In this situation, the party tried to use a structural dismissal to get around the normal priority order and pay certain creditors while skipping others. The Supreme Court made it clear that the convenience is not a valid reason to break rules that the Congress created in the bankruptcy code. Those rules exist to create an orderly and predictable process, and the court emphasized that judges and parties must stay within those boundaries. One of the most important effects of the ruling is the protection it provides to employees and other priority creditors. In the Jevic case, the workers had legitimate wage claims that rank higher priority than the other general unsecured creditors. Yet, the settlement tried to cut them out completely. The court's decisions ensures that the workers and similar priority groups cannot be pushed aside through strategic deals. This helped prevent situations in which law is specifically designed to protect people from getting nothing because a more powerful party negotiated a different outcome. The ruling also closed on the doors attempts by stronger parties, such as secured lenders or private equity firm, to use a creative legal strategies to get around the bankruptcy code. Without this decision, a structural dismissal could have become a loophole that allows certain creditors to team up and leave others behind. By making it clear that the priority rule still applies at the end of the case, the court prevents this kind of end-run tactics. It keeps the bankruptcy system fair, stops collusive bargains, and ensures that the protection written into the code cannot be bypassed just because the settlement seems easier and more convenient. Thank you.